and social sciences, who are all working on topics that are related to the ways that COVID is changing our culture and society.
So to that end, a bit about the plan for the session. Each of the talks that you're going to see today are going to be between 10 and 15 minutes. And that's going to be followed by an hour for questions and discussion. So for everybody that's attending here, we are going to invite you to type your questions into the chat window there. There's a little Q&A chat window. And you can actually type those. You don't have to wait until you forgot the question in the question and answer session. You can type them anytime when it occurs to you. And we're going to be going back through those and organizing them ourselves during that session. So if you have questions, by all means, let fly. In the meantime, we're also going to be recording the event. And so, as you may have noticed, that's just connected now, and the event will be available later for you to watch after it's over.
We'd also like to let everyone know that we believe when we get to the question and answer session, we will have the ability to turn attendees' microphones on so you can speak your own question if you want to. Now, there's always a possibility that technology won't be helpful to us, but that's what we're going to try to do. So when you post your questions in the chat window, if you could just make a little one-word note at the end, speak if you want to speak it, or read if you'd rather have us read it. And then we'll just know whether or not to turn your microphone on for that question. So without further ado, we'd like to start by introducing tonight's first presenter.
Our first presenter tonight is Sophie Harman. She's a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London, where she teaches and conducts research into global health politics, African agency, and international relations, as well as visual politics. In 2016, she co-wrote and produced her first narrative feature film, Pili, which was nominated for a BAFTA in 2019. Her COVID-19 work has included co-founding the Gender and COVID-19 Working Group, a joint collaboration with UN Women, filming videos on global health security, and providing briefings to the UK government and to the UN. COVID-19 has led to increased recognition of the gendered impacts, burdens, and implications of pandemics. That recognition is important. However, of equal importance is what comes next. Dr. Harman's talk considers what a feminist response to pandemics such as COVID-19 might look like. Dr. Harman.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. A slight tweak to my planned talk is I'm actually doing a more of a context, so we can for sure talk more about gender in the Q&A, and I'll be very happy to do so. I'm actually going to frame my talk around the 3 questions I get asked the most about COVID-19. That's why didn't we see this coming? How did we get here? And what happens next? Or more popularly, when does this end? Someone tell me when this will end. So it's a lot of ground to cover in the next 12 minutes. So if there's anything you want me to go into more detail in the Q&A, I'd be more than happy to. So to start then, why didn't we see this coming? Well, the short answer is we did-ish. So the whole architecture of global health security is set up to be able to detect and respond to any type of outbreaks. This is predicated on the idea of when, not if. So there's always an assumption that this is going to happen. These warning systems are embedded within the World Health Organization through the international health regulations that were revised in 2005 after SARS, which were meant to sort of like provide the framework on the infrastructure for this detection and response, and also the Health Emergencies Programme, which was very much strengthened after the 2014-16 Ebola crisis. So you're going to see multiple outbreaks or health concerns happening throughout the year. This happens all the time within the WHO. The key is for the WHO to then work with states to really assess the severity of this issue or whether it will go beyond a border. So this is the big key thing when we think about public health emergencies. If an outbreak is seen to be a threat or go beyond borders, the WHO has the power to, and this is a bit of a mouthful, declare a public health emergency of international concern. Now, this is the big red flag. They're sort of like, hey, folks, we need to pay attention to this. And it was at the end of January, on the 30th of January 2020, that the WHO did declare COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. Now, for some people, that was too late. They said it should have happened earlier. Some people, it's too soon. It's just an arbitrary debate. This happens all the time. Now, why I'm sort of summarizing this it's so important to know that these institutions and functions exist, because over the last 6 months, it's become somewhat of a sport to say, why didn't we see this coming? We need tools and institutions to do this. We need to create new tools. They already exist. Crucially, those states that are having poor responses to COVID-19, so some of those with the highest case numbers and deaths, have heavily invested in global health security. If you look at any of these states' national security plans, you will see a line on global health security. Now, you can say, well, these plans, whatever, they're just written down, they cover all threats. But it's really important to note that they did see a threat sometime in the future. It's the scale of the threat you cannot necessarily predict. So whenever you hear a politician say, you know, no one saw this coming, this is a once in a lifetime thing, rubbish. There were systems, there were warnings, the WHO was flagging this throughout January. The problem is not that we didn't see it coming, it's what you do with the threat. And that leads me to my second point. How did we get here? Now, when I say how did we get here, what I'm talking about is 60 million cases of COVID-19 and 1.4 million deaths. So that is huge. That's extremely significant. It's obviously of pandemic status. Now, where these cases and deaths are happening, the most three countries, the problem areas really, are the United States, Brazil, and India. And what's been interesting about this is when health emergencies happen, people say, well, it's not going to be in those states that have global health security expertise or have high income functioning health systems. It's always going to be in low income countries. There's always this othering from Western states that, you know, these things, they happen over there. They don't happen here in North America or Europe. So what went wrong and what went right? In many ways, it's too soon to tell, but we can identify some general trends. The obvious failings have been around the government response. So the most obvious is denial and downplaying of the threat, lacking of any basics. Now, as we said in introduction, I'm a professor of international politics. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a public health expert, even though I've worked on global health politics for 15 years. And even I know the first thing you do if you see a threat is you protect your health workers, you protect your care workers, you get equipment to them and what they need. It's the most fundamental basic. The other basic you need is a system for finding out what is happening with the disease. So a track and trace system. Here in the UK, we're obsessed with track and trace because of the multiple problems that have happened with our system. Also poor communication. So when you're having a lockdown, if you're having a lockdown, how that's going to happen, how restrictions are rolled out, and as well as a lack of trust in government. So this is another factor. Finally, when we look at obvious failings of the government response, and I say this as the first day of 16 days of action of violence against women, is we know from previous outbreaks, such as Ebola, that health emergencies exacerbate inequalities and tensions within society. So when we saw rates of violence against women going up during periods of lockdown or restrictions, this should have been predicted. We've seen it before. It makes sense. Anyone who can think about this could have joined the dots on that. Finally, there was a failure to learn from previous outbreaks. So those states that learned from previous outbreaks, whether it was previous pandemic flus, Ebola, Zika, AIDS, SARS, you could see a kind of response happening, taking it seriously, thinking, what can we learn? Now, states are aware of some of these failings. Many do not admit to some of these failings, and therefore the tendency is to look to blame something else. And we can all guess who got most of the blame for this: the WHO, the World Health Organization, and this idea that the system wasn't right and the system wasn't working. Now, the critique of the WHO tends to be focused around the most obvious, Trump's attack on the WHO's relationship with China. Now, it's not just Trump and the US. You also see some of this criticism from some politicians in Australia, for example. The sense here that the WHO was too generous to China, that they didn't really investigate the issue in such a way or call China out that they thought that they were hiding something. The WHO's response to this is they were incredibly transparent. that they were engaged in this idea of quiet diplomacy, that if you go all in calling out states and naming and shaming, the state's not going to let you into that country to investigate the outbreak. The other issue that was very contentious was around borders and travel restrictions. So it seems that an automatic reaction to an outbreak like this is just shut everything down. And this is what all my family said to me. They said, why didn't we just shut all the borders? Shut the borders. Under the international health regulations within the WHO, there is a recommendation not to shut borders. Now, this is because by the time you shut the borders, you probably have a case in your country anyway, by the time you're at that point. It can lead to discriminatory practices on borders, and it can also be a barrier to getting things into the country, such as personal protective equipment and other commodities. So this is a real point of tension that you're going to see around the WHO's role in this, should this have been more explicit. And so then generally this whole question of, does global health security work? Is it up to scratch? The other trends that I sort of pointed to earlier, and I really want to unpack a little bit more, is really the arrogance of some of the Western states here. This kind of othering of, okay, we've got global health security. We send experts to these low and middle income countries. We tell people how to do it. We've got this covered. It seemed that outbreaks or health emergencies were things that happened in other countries. If you look at the rhetoric around sub-Saharan Africa, this is particularly interesting, because lots of people were sort of saying, wow, when it comes to Africa, whole of Africa, it's going to be a disaster. What happens when it comes to informal settlements? And yet we haven't seen the crisis that everybody was sort of predicting. And when you think about why, most people say, well, it's a young population in Africa and, the weather, it's hot, so it's much better. There is no recognition that there is expertise in these states that might be doing some of the fundamentals much better than those states in the West as well. Finally, the other trend to speak on is, of course, populism. So the relationship between populist leaders and this denial of the extent and severity of the threat and the relationship to science. Now, when we combine these factors, so denial, weak systems, lack of trust, populism, you have quite a toxic combination for what comes next. So this is my final kind of talking points. What happens next? Of course, we've all been talking about the last 2 weeks, vaccines. Okay, so of course, the pace and scale of endeavour that has gone into identifying these 3 hopefully successful vaccines is incredible. But of course, there are 3 cautions that come with this as well. You see, this is why I don't get invited to dinner parties, because everyone's like, this is going to be fine. I'm like, oh, no, not so much. The most obvious is vaccine nationalism. So global health security is predicated on the idea of collective security. It's not about states protecting their own interests. We're only as safe as the most vulnerable. Now, what's clever is global health institutions were aware of this when they were thinking about the vaccine, so set up this institution called COVAX. This is the idea that vaccines should be available throughout the world. The kicker there, of course, is it's guaranteed only for 20% of a population within a state. Then the state has to match that funding. So it's from the off, you can see what the problem is there when you're thinking that you need to vaccinate, I think, something between 80 and 90% of the population for it to be effective. But we'll see. Also, you never know what's going to happen until there's a vaccine and how this plays out. So that's the vaccine nationalism. And I say this again as a British person whose government is buying up all the vaccines as much as they can, whilst also giving to COVAX. So you see a bit of both happening. The second concern is vaccine security, which I don't think we talk about enough. We already see the intellectual property being attempts to steal the intellectual property from the servers of those scientists involved in vaccine discovery and delivery. So we have sort of a cybersecurity threat there that's very much linked to the vaccine. The vaccine is also going to be a commodity, and it's going to be a commodity that is in demand. So what are the protections around that? And also then, who protects the vaccine? Is it local doctors' surgeries? Is it something more like the military's involvement? These are some very important questions. Finally, there's the question of vaccine hesitancy. So vaccine hesitancy is, okay, we might have a vaccine, but are people actually going to want to take it? Now, the three drivers, according to a recent report from the University of Sussex and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, says that vaccine hesitancy around COVID is driven by three factors. I'm sorry, academics just love threes. Speed in which the vaccine was discovered, rumour, and trust. And this third one, trust, is hugely important. Do you trust the government to effectively roll this out and have your best interests at heart? So the issue is really not the vaccine itself, but the politics around the vaccine. We always say vaccines are not magic bullets. They exist within wider contexts in which they're rolled out. So my sort of final point on this is it's exciting about the vaccine, but we don't want to lose our heads around this. We have to maintain the measures that are in place. COVID-19 is not going to disappear by Christmas or Easter. There's a lot of buzz in the UK. It was like, Easter, we're all going to be free again. I'm just going to put out that I don't think that's going to happen. The solution really is to stop thinking about time and our obsession with these kind of big events. When we do this, we're speeding up these kind of, what do we do? How do we make sense of it? And I'm sure some of my other colleagues are going to talk about the temporality of some of these issues as well. Crucially, from all my years of doing research on Ebola and HIV and AIDS, is the one thing I've learned, it's people and communities, not governments, that stop pandemics. It's our own behaviours, it's what we do, it's how we interrelate. Governments, some governments, not all governments have a role, have actually helped create this mess. It's the politics that drives it, not the disease. And it's scientists, medical professionals, volunteers who volunteered for the vaccine trials, carers, communities that are actually going to get us out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harman. Sophie Harman is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you so much.
Now we're going to move on to our second presenter, who will be able to elaborate on some of the topics that Dr. Harman brought up regarding rumor and misinformation about vaccines, as just one example. Andrea Kitta is an associate professor in the Department of English at East Carolina University and a folklorist who specializes in medicine, belief, and the supernatural. Her current research includes vaccines, pandemic illness, contagion and contamination, stigmatized diseases, disability, health information on the internet, and Slender Man. She has published 2 books on these topics. The first, published in 2012, is Vaccinations and Public Concern in History, Legend, Rumor, and Risk Perception. And the second, published in 2019, is The Kiss of Death, Contagion, Contamination, and Folklore. Both of these books were awarded the Brian McConnell Book Award, which recognizes excellence in contemporary legend research. So in her talk, Dr. Kitta will be discussing COVID-19 rumor, misinformation, and urban legends, and how they've affected medical decision-making and policy.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, and it's going to be very hard to follow up that just amazing presentation. So as you mentioned, I have been working on vaccination for probably about 17 years now. And in the past, I've worked on both childhood and the flu vaccine. And of course, now I'm working on the COVID vaccine. But more importantly, a lot of my research really looks at that intersection of medicine and folklore. So especially when we look at that, we think of things like rumor, urban legends, and conspiracy theories. So those are the main areas that I tend to look at. This has gotten ramped up amazingly in the past few years, both because of everything that's happening in the world, but also because of the internet. So the internet is really putting things out at a much higher speed. And a lot of times I hear people say like, oh, this is the internet's fault. This is all the internet. And I keep trying to remind people that the internet is a tool. It is how we use it. And that conspiracy theories existed before the internet. It just took them a little bit longer to get around. So this is more of the real issue, is how fast things are getting around. And also that we have people not looking at the sources that they're getting their information from, especially on social media. So the big thing I want to talk about today is how the information that we receive and the information that we pass on, and how we understand that information, because that's a lot of what I do, is trying to process that. How does this help us make medical decisions? And the answer is, it's not always a good thing, especially when we don't have a lot of information, which is exactly what's happening right now with COVID. So in any sort of incident where we are not getting information as fast as we would like it, this causes basically vacuums in information. And then what fills those vacuums are things that make sense to us. And sometimes those things that make sense are based off of our understanding of science, be it as it is, and sometimes it's things like rumors and legends and conspiracy theories. So we're hungry for that information. Probably a lot of you still are hungry for that information. We were when this all started, and we weren't getting information, not as fast as we wanted it. So there's this real disconnect between the way that people in the sciences actually put out information and the way that we perceive it. And of course, it's filtered through the media to us. So that's a really complicated process. And that's part of where a lot of that breakdown happens. So we get information, and that information isn't always exactly as it's intended. And there's very different languages, of course, that are used too, both by medical professionals, but also the public. So when we hear that something's a theory, a medical professional might say, oh, there's really good research on that, but they're never going to say it's 100%. But we hear theory and think like, oh, it's just something that they've come up with. It's not, it's not necessarily the thing that's going to happen. So when that disconnect happens, there's a lot of room there for rumors, legends, conspiracy theories to take over. And that's exactly what has happened. And I'm not going to get into all the details of them because I want to talk about how important it is that when we understand these things, we understand them locally. And that's going to be big. Now, I've been monitoring the internet and looking at that, and I've been looking at some specific places, including Newfoundland and where I live in Eastern North Carolina. And it's really interesting to see what's getting filtered from the internet, from social media, but also what's happening sort of organically here on the ground and what people are telling each other. And this is another disconnect that we have, is a lot of times when we get public health information, it is that more sort of blanket, like we're going to tell you this, and that's going to be applicable to everyone. That's not how it works, though. That's good initial information, but we also need to understand how people process that information and what decisions they make based off of that information. So just to give you a couple of examples, I'm currently working on a grant. It's a CARES grant, and we're talking about vaccine ethics. And one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how people are perceiving the vaccine, even though it's not even really out yet. Just recently have we even heard about the vaccine. But before we even knew about that, we have been for months talking about how are people going to perceive this vaccine. So we're looking at a lot of different folk groups and trying to figure out both how they're perceiving it, but also what groups they're in that intersect. So for example, we're looking at race and ethnicity as specific groups in Eastern North Carolina. We're looking at occupation. In particular, we're looking at the prison workers versus the agricultural workers in the area. We have a lot of migrant workers here. So we're looking at them. We're also looking at, of course, politics and what effect does that have on all of this? Because I'm sure, as you all know, regardless of whether or not you live in the States, you get to hear all about what happens here. So you're probably very aware that politics have become increasingly important. And what side you are on politically actually determines some of your behavior. Not all of your behavior, it's not always that simple, but we have seen some real strong determinants with especially people who supported Trump not wearing masks and people who supported Biden as wearing masks. So that is definitely a dividing line. And it is perceived that if you go out wearing a mask, that you must be a Biden supporter. So there's things perceived about you while you're out there as well. So we have to consider all of this. We've also been talking about, I'm in a college town, so we're talking about college students. We also, unfortunately, the place where I live tends to make the international news for very bad reasons most of the time. The most recent one was that we had a 400-person party that happened in, I think it was late August or early September, that made international news. I actually heard about it from my family in Newfoundland before I heard about it here, which is hilarious considering how I live here. But it was interesting because we also had to point out that the college students wouldn't have come back to town if we wouldn't have put the university back in session. So that's another discussion that we need to have. It's not always, but the college students are really convenient group of people to blame here. So we have to think about that. We have to think about all of those intersections. And it does get really complicated. So I might be looking at agricultural workers who are Latinx, but who are also Trump supporters. So there's a lot of conflicting, for what my perception as an outsider, conflicting information there. But they make it all work. So all of those intersections of who they are, their identity, and what decisions they make are really, really intertwined into this very, very complicated identity. The other thing that we have to really think about too is what vaccines and who they're going to go to. So we know now, of course, that we have 3 out that are, kind of the best contenders right now. We've got Pfizer, Moderna, and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. However, there is at some point, we're still a little too early in this process, but at some point, there is going to be a perception that some of these vaccines are better than others. And that is going to cause some major problems because people are going to what they perceive as the good vaccine. And of course, right now, what we know the differences about these vaccines, and of course, we don't know everything right now because this is all still coming out, is that it has a lot to do with storage. So we know that certain ones have to be stored at very, very cold temperatures. Others are a little bit more shelf stable. So that might actually be the defining factor, but it's also going to be where they're sent. So if we look at where these vaccines are going to be sent, how that's going to be very much perceived as which one is good and which one is bad, or which one is better, I should say, to some extent. So we have to consider all of that. We have to think about the history of that. And this is a big thing that we have been talking a lot about with this medical ethics group, is thinking about the history, in particular, the history of experimentation, medical experimentation, and medical racism, especially on people that are Latinx, on Indigenous people, and on people who are Black. And this is going to be a major issue. We're already talking about, I'm already having conversations with people who have already started saying things like, oh, the AstraZeneca one is the one I want because it's been tested on people like me, which is interesting. Then I've also heard people say, I don't want that one because that's clearly not the good one, or they would have tested it someplace else. So there's already becoming really loaded issues already starting. And I mean, this is, these announcements have just happened, right? We've had no time at all, but there's already rumors circulating about the vaccines and about what they're going to do, or if they're going to be more effective than other vaccines. So I think that's something that we definitely have to have as part of this conversation. We have to think about it, but we also really have to think about this as being a local problem. And we have to think about it as being specific to certain areas. And we actually have to have conversations with people, which was what no one likes about my research. It's that I have to tell everybody there's no single little sort of blanket statement that we can put out there and everybody's going to go like, oh, okay, well, now that you said that, I'll completely get the vaccine. It doesn't work like that. So we need, in addition to wonderful vaccines that are being made appropriately and made well, we need people alongside of them also explaining why these vaccines have been appropriate and are made well, and that are actually addressing the real concerns of the people who are there. And that's another thing I tell people too. We don't, because they're like, well, let's just list all the concerns. No, let's not do that, because that actually like reinforces and gives people beliefs they may have never even heard of. So they might not be aware of some of the rumors or conspiracy theories going around. They hear them and they're like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. And then they add that to all the reasons why they don't want to get the vaccine. So we don't want to do this as a giant blanket statement either. So that's kind of one of my big points in all of this, is that our discussions about vaccines, they have to be local. They also have to be open-minded, and they have to be non-judgmental. We are not going to make any progress with any people if we just say, well, you need to take this vaccine, don't be stupid about it. That's not a great way to talk to people, right? So we have to actually have a conversation with them, talk about their real fears, why are they choosing to get, and also why are they choosing to get the vaccine? What's been the convincing factors? What was it about the vaccine that they were like, yes, I need to get this? And what we're going to find in a lot of that is they're going to be more influenced by personal experience stories than they are by numbers. And this is a mistake that I see over and over and over again, is especially when physicians get on TV, when public health gets on TV, they get on there and they give you all the numbers, which is great. That's their role. But we also need somebody up there going, okay, let me tell you this story. Let me tell you about what it was like when I had COVID. Let me tell you about, as a nurse, what it's been like working in these places. And we are getting people starting to tell these stories, and these stories are really becoming very popular, and they're becoming very noticeable. So we actually need to promote them. And a lot of people don't want to, because they consider them to be not reliable evidence. It's like, well, no, but that's what moves people. Those stories are what moves people. So we really have to think about those stories, and we have to use those stories to our advantage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kitta. That was a really fascinating talk on a subject I think a lot of us are seeing a great deal of in the media, conspiracy theories and concerns about issues like vaccines. So again, Dr. Kitta, if you'd like to learn more about her, is Associate Professor in the Department of English at East Carolina University.
So our next speaker tonight is Ashleigh Weeden. She's an award-winning rural innovator and a community developer currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Guelph. Her research is focused on the ways place, power, and policy influence rural innovation and capacity development. A longtime advocate for public sector renewal and community-based innovation in rural Canada, her work can be read in publications like The Conversation, Municipal World, Canadian Government Executive, and The Torontoist. Weeden will be speaking about the changing rural-urban dynamics of the post-pandemic era, particularly a potential urban exodus to small towns, asking questions about what the right to the city and the right to be rural looks like in policy and in practice. Ashleigh Weeden.
Hi, and I'm delighted to be joining folks from not just Newfoundland, but from all over the place tonight. And I was just actually speaking with a variety of rural leaders from across Canada through a panel with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities this afternoon as well. So having lots of great conversations about things that are near and dear to my heart, which is right out of the gate, place matters. And so this follows really beautifully from your stuff, Andrea, in the fact that matters, and the fact that we're meeting virtually right now, and there's a lot of arguments about the compressed 21st century and that time-space continuum is now so short that borders don't matter, and technological innovation has sent us into a place where we can be anywhere. For the most part, we choose or end up somewhere for very particular reasons that aren't often rational. You know, there's nothing rational about human beings, and often the work that I do gets caught up in regional science and spatial economics, and they like to math about people, and I like to people about people. So when we talk about how the pandemic is playing out in terms of its impacts on the rural urban, I think it's really important. One, I've chosen that language very carefully. It's not a divide as we normally put it. There's far more linkages and interdependencies between rural and urban communities than often get discussed. And you know, it makes no difference if you have a food desert because your local grocery store closed and you have to drive an hour into the nearest town center, or if you have a food desert because you're in an urban neighborhood that's only serviced by convenience stores. That experience is far more similar than people would give rural and urban communities credit for. So get out of the gate, those linkages are really important to me. And early in this pandemic, as someone who lives rurally, works rurally, but also has a seasonal property on a First Nation up around the Bruce Peninsula, I noticed this really kind of troubling dynamic where a lot of people were trying to sort of position it that this made a great reason to head to their cottage or to go somewhere out into the country to escape the pandemic, because there was this perception that disease and density were connected, despite the fact that it has far more to do with structural inequality than it does to how close we are living to each other. And that remains true throughout these last 9 months. But everyone from Justin Timberlake heading off to Montana to a cabin, to Instagram influencers fleeing New York, to just even our premier here in Ontario going up to check the plumbing in his cottage, we were having this really difficult conversation of, do you have a right to go to these places if you own property there, if you have been often an intergenerational member of the community? Seasonal property owners are not really invaders. They're often members of the community, but during a time where that perceived threat is, you know, viruses don't travel, people do. If we were to import that virus into areas that historically in the early months of the pandemic, were doing quite well at keeping it at bay, limited healthcare resources, limited grocery services, strained capacity in the supply chains for everything, there was a lot of fear there, going so far as to having local mayors here in Ontario authorize or sort of put a municipal order in place that prevented local tradespeople services to primarily seasonal property dwellings, all the way through to a county here in Ontario as well, offering a municipal order saying that cottagers could not come to the community, and First Nations that had leased land to cottagers for decades closing their borders to keep themselves safe. The response from a lot of people was kind of almost exactly what you could imagine. You know, we're going to withhold our property taxes. You can't keep me away. And we never had, say, at least not throughout most of the country, there's been sort of some interregional softer borders go on, but within a province, there's never been this idea that you can't go from community to community the way we've seen in other countries. And without those kind of hard rules, we had to rely on exactly as what our first two speakers were talking about, people's ability to weigh their individual actions with their community impacts. So how do I think of myself not just only as a property owner or someone that is entitled to this space through whatever legal framework is in front of me, but someone who's also responsible to those places and accountable to those places and to other people that are there. If I truly love this place the way that I'm saying, but I want to be there as a place of respite for me, then what would be an expression of love during a pandemic? Is it to end up in those places and risk bringing extra burden on a system that may not be able to carry you, or risk exposure to people who are often without emergency services, so much so that we had rural doctors finding out how to make ventilators serve more than one patient, and how do you make an ambulance ventilator work for longer than the emergency intervention it was designed to do? The flip coin of this is that mobility rights are enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? So we can't tell people, no, you do not have a right to go there. But this also covers up a very contested and complex relationship to place that draws its roots back to the trauma of colonialism. And so the very notion of cottage country or of a second property kind of is stemmed on all of these things that Tressie Cotton Macmillan said was wealth is the vector. So whoever has the means to have a secondary property means that you have a primary property, you are already housed. And so it's difficult to run into that conversation with people who may be income insecure or struggling to be housed or meet their basic needs, saying, why is the biggest fight in your life about whether or not you get to go to your lakeside property? Secondly, we have issues around displacement, and this is continuing now post the emergency early days, as particularly here in Ontario, but I know certainly this has happened through the Maritimes and the Atlantic provinces over the last several years, of people that are noticing that now that they can work from home or that they have the means to do so, so primarily white, upper class, working white collar professionals, are saying, well, I don't need to have a place in Toronto, or I'll keep that and maybe rent it, and I'll buy property in a small or a rural community or stay at the cottage year round. But what happens to the people that they displace? Where did they go? And we have markets now getting so hot in actually unexpected places that people who live and work in those areas can no longer afford to live there. So you may have a whole working class, white collar professional change in demographics happening in smaller communities. But then where do the people that work at the local diner live? Where do the people that work in the mechanic's office live? Where do the people that work in your grocery store live? Related to this, we end up with this sort of K-shaped economy that actually has spatial implications of where people live and work in terms of the map of both urban and rural Canada. The effect of urban flight has always been away from sort of the issues that we find distasteful or uncomfortable or othering. We want to go places that feel safe and small c conservative in a lot of ways in terms of things that are not threatening. And we're seeing this narrative play out in terms of rural spaces. The idea here is that rural areas are almost never talked about in terms of their inherent value. And so much like Sophie, I like things that go in threes. And if we're going to be negotiating this as we move forward, we have to ask three questions. Do we value rural places, not only in what they can provide to non-rural people as an extractive source of resource, which they historically have been, whether through stealing of land, through extraction of energy and natural resources, or through agriculture? Do we value them beyond what they provide in those terms? And now with the new extractive resource of tourism and consumption as a place of respite and leisure, if we do value them, is there a right to be rural, much like there's a right to the city? How do we define what the commons are in a rural setting where so much of our language about community development is grounded and centered in urban notions? How do we reframe ideas around community connection when you can't necessarily build high density housing in a rural setting? It's not going to work. So how do you position those new service delivery initiatives in a way that we reach people? And thirdly, who gets to decide? All of these questions about rural displacement, about whether you have a right to go to the cottage or not, and whether you should consider moving out of Toronto to go live in Wingham or Pickle Lake, or which is the farthest north you can fly, you can drive on the road before you have to start flying north, or to anywhere else. You know, who gets to decide these things? Who's at the decision-making table? More often than not, these decisions are made by people who have never set foot in a rural community, that don't understand the dynamics of these places, and also tend to think of them as a monolith. So in a lot of policy discussions, we end up with rural, remote, and First Nations, as if that's all one thing. And instead of saying that if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one, responses need to be place-based. And we think about this sort of in the context of COVID, is that these dynamics were happening all along, much like both Sophie and Andrea, and I'm assuming that Michael will say as well. These are not new cracks in the system, but what this has done is exposed a lot of the ways in which we think about rural-urban dynamics. So rural places are cities in waiting, or they're failed urban experiments, or they should strive to be like their urban counterparts, and here, let me fix it for you. And then also, if that's not of interest, what can I take from you? What can I get out of this? Do I escape my urban environment that I've thought all the way along was entirely far superior to your rural one in order to consume the space or the luxury of leisure space that I perceive in rural areas? When it comes to the healthcare services, government services, as we move to a digital by default, I have so much empathy with you, Shannon, and others with broadband issues. I've worked on the national broadband portfolio for quite a long time, and we assume that all of these things are the same, and they're not in large parts of rural areas around the world. When we talk about whether or not people have access to testing, to be able to accurately get that test back in enough time that it matters, whether they have access to primary health care that will let them get emergency services if they need it, and what happens if that one emergency bed in a local region is taken up by something such as COVID, it's not available when someone has a heart attack. And then finally, what do we want to do moving forward? I think that in a lot of rural communities across Canada, we talk as if we've survived it and what's coming next. The discussion is already about recovery, and I'm excited to hear what Michael will have to say about resilience. I have some personal critiques about resilience and the expectations that people will be resilient rather than fixing the conditions that require them to be resilient at all. And in rural Canada and rural communities, when it came to COVID, we've done a lot of celebrating about that doctor that made a ventilator serve 6 patients, or about the businesses that pivoted to making PPE in order to contribute to the effort, almost like the home front, if we were using the metaphors of war, which I'm not fussy on, but people have been using a lot. When we talk about these things and we look at these stories and celebrate them as workarounds, whether it's the municipal office keeping their Wi-Fi on so kids can submit their homework when they can't get service at home, or the doctor making that. But we forget to talk about how then do we change that as the base condition that they had to do that at all? Why is that something that we sit and celebrate, not as a Band-Aid and an emergency response, but something that has to be carried on for a long time period after that? And so in this conversation, and I'm just going to start wrapping up, is that all of these dynamics, when we think about them, tend to be positioned as this is going to be good for rural communities if people are leaving urban environments and wanting to go there. But the locus of economic and social and political control is still remaining in cities. Our dynamics aren't changing in terms of how we're thinking about that. And if we have any chance around actually making this good for both rural and urban dwellers and recovering from this pandemic in a way that doesn't just send us back to the status quo, but makes things better, we really have to dig into why we've allowed things to become those kinds of systems as they are. So I'll quit now because I could talk about it forever and a half. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashleigh. And, you know, as a reporter here in Newfoundland and Labrador, the rural-urban divide, this is a province that's almost entirely rural, really. So these kinds of issues, you're right, are the issues that we've been talking about all along that are just being exacerbated by COVID, issues of access and issues of the rights of people that live in those spaces. So I'm excited to keep reporting on those things as they get further exacerbated by the pandemic. Woohoo. Anyway, thank you very much. Ashleigh Weeden, everybody.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Orsini. Dr. Orsini is a professor of the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's a critical policy scholar with interests in health politics and policy. His work highlights in particular the perspectives of people who are typically marginalized from policymaking. He has co-edited 5 books on the intersections between identity, medicine, and policy, including Seeing Red, HIV, AIDS, and Public Policy in Canada, Mobilizing Metaphor, Art, Culture, and Disability Activism in Canada, and Worlds of Autism across the spectrum of neurological difference. So this evening, Dr. Orsini will be speaking about how promoting resilience can actually harm us by placing the onus on individuals to overcome difficulties instead of acknowledging the structural conditions that make bouncing back more challenging than it sounds. Dr. Orsini.
Thanks so much, Ainsley and Andrew, and thanks to Isabelle and the Nexus folks for the kind of invitation. No pressure to be the last speaker after hearing my fabulous co-panelists, so I'm going to try to say something semi-meaningful here. I work also in disability studies, so as an access issue, I just wanted to say lots of folks are probably able to do that, but just wanted to encourage people to do what they need to do in the space to feel comfortable. And I think virtual meetings really facilitate that in the way that sometimes in-person gatherings do not. I also want to describe myself. I'm a white man, about 6 feet tall. I have a goatee. I'm wearing turquoise colored glasses that I love. And I have rapidly thinning hair, a common experience of middle-aged guys. So we're all trying to live with COVID. And I think for me, it's also trying to think with and think about COVID. I have the privilege of being afforded the space to think with you. And I think the privilege comes with the responsibility to ask a few questions. And the main one, as Ainsley was saying, for me, centers on resilience, which I didn't realize I was so cranky about until I wrote a short piece about it for a place called Policy Options, a website. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, and when I want to talk here, I want to just link resilience to a question posed by several years ago, like 2 decades ago, by Paula Treichler, who I think is a cultural historian. I'm not sure what her. And she asked, how do we have theory in an epidemic? And she was writing during the height of the AIDS crisis, and she used this term, she called AIDS an epidemic of signification, a crisis of meaning. And so that's sort of where I'm starting. I think what does it mean to think about resilience in the time of COVID in a moment of really profound crisis that has reverberated across multiple registers, political, obviously, economic, social, and I think at an affective level. I'm going to talk about the role of emotions too toward the end if I have time, but I'm going to probably run out of time. The title of the talk, I just to provoke, is Against Resilience. Like academics, I put a question mark after resilience, but I just want to use that as a way to think about what motivates all this talk and why I think it's really problematic. And I'm taking my cue from a book, a really interesting book called Against Health by 2 American scholars, Jonathan Metzl and Anna Kirkland, where they kind of lay out why it's really important to be critical of how health is mobilized in popular discourse. They talk about this notion of healthism, sort of health as a new ideology. So like them, they're not against health. I'm not against resilience. I'm not against the idea of people managing or coping with adversity. But I'm concerned about this kind of moral ground that occupies its political salience. And I think once you start thinking about resilience, it appears to be everywhere. I get emails from folks that, yesterday there was an email from the president of my university inviting me to a virtual event to celebrate our resilience. I was just kind of like, it's never ending. Lauren Berlant, in a really great book, coins this term cruel optimism, in which she describes as existing when, quote, something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. And I think about that when I think about resilience. She says these kinds of optimistic relations are not inherently cruel, but they become cruel when the object that drives your attention actively impedes the aim that brought you to it initially. And so in the last part of my remarks, if I have time, I want to talk about this jumble of affects and emotions. I'm trying to write a book about emotions right now, and I have a lot of feelings about that, but I'm trying to write a book that sort of talks about COVID too in the context of what I sort of term an emotional landscape as a way to illustrate that there are feelings other than resilience we should be paying attention to. If we're interested in the political responses and the policy responses to COVID, and I heard that across my 3 co-panelists in different kinds of ways, I think ignoring this affective realm is really just wrong. So my remarks are kind of taken in the spirit of, well, you know, Sarah Ahmed's idea of a feminist killjoy. You know, Sarah Ahmed says you can be a killjoy because of what you bring up wherever you meet up. And she says, if the feminist killjoy gets in the way of happiness, to claim this figure is to be willing to get in the way. And so in the next, I don't know how much time I have left, I just want to get in the way a little, get in the way of how people think about and celebrate and hail resilience. So what's wrong with it? I mean, I'm also going to say there are 3 things wrong with it. I don't know, we didn't plan this in advance. But I see, you know, it's a real powerful discursive move that shifts discussion to something that's seen as more productive, more forward thinking. And normally when you talk about resilience, we talk about bouncing back. And what's interesting is that some folks, I'm thinking of scholars like Alison Howell, a really interesting critical scholar of international relations, also talks about bouncing forward. So it's not always about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. So as far as the three problems I have before moving on to the next part, I think first, I think there's this natural symbiosis between the will to resilience and a discourse of blame. And although there have been lots of discussion, and you know, once you start looking at literature about the role of communities and the need for balance, and not just saying resilience is all that bad, it's really difficult to kind of avoid this conclusion that the locus of attention is this individual subject who is, you know, a kind of almost a newly minted entrepreneurial subject too, who works hard at being resilient. So when we talk about that, some people use the term responsibilization. This is really kind of a fundamental question about what is the role of the state vis-a-vis citizens, like what is that interaction like? And the thing that's been interesting in sort of doing this reading and thinking about it for me has been that that talking about this responsibilization is important, but thinking also about how it's not just about responsibilization. We have to talk about how resilience talk and resilience discourse is about enhancement. That's the term that Alison Howell uses in her work, this idea of bouncing forward, so that it's not just about coping or managing with adversity. What folks have been looking at, and I think COVID is an interesting opportunity to look at that as well, is that managing COVID, dealing with COVID matters, but also sort of what folks are trying to kind of invoke is this idea that you're going to be able to deal well with the next disruption, with the next calamity around the corner. So it's not just about intervening with COVID specifically. Secondly, I think, you know, here we are talking about building resilience. And I mean, I think Ashleigh also brought this up. Sometimes the structures that stand in the way need to be dismantled, right? So we're talking about dismantling structure, you know, talking about structural racism, racial capitalism, colonialism, colonial dispossession, you know, and so, you know, on the one hand, here we are talking about building, but really the metaphor that's probably more apt is beginning to sort of dismantle some of the structures. And resilience is not super helpful. I will say, though, that what I've been interested in is also how resilience is taken up in Indigenous communities, which is quite different in the sense that it really is focused on community and but also kind of resistance as opposed to resilience. So there's a different way, a different take, but it's also, I think, informed by the fact that Indigenous people understand health and well-being quite differently than Western folks. And then the third problem I have with resilience, I mean, the 3 that I've identified, is how ableist it is. So the notion of overcoming, the notion of inspiring others, you know, Ashleigh gave examples of, wow, you know, what you can do when you're given a few lemons, right? This idea that what doesn't sort of kill you will make you stronger. Disability scholars, for me, have been really helpful in thinking about how ableism is also sort of a structuring institution in our society. And when people sort of talk about disability, they still kind of find comfort or solace in inspiring narratives of people who overcome disability instead of understanding the lived experience of disability. So I mean, the people that I've been reading sort of talk about this notion of why, you know, of cripping resilience, using kind of the idea of cripping as a way of kind of disrupting how we think about a term. And that for me is really helpful and generative, because this idea that, people have to sort of overcome adversity for folks in, in disability communities has been really pernicious, and especially in the time of COVID. The other thing I wanted to sort of say about resilience, and it also I think loops back to something Andrea was saying about story. I see stories of resilience as really causal stories. Am I doing okay for time? Sorry. I said I'm a critical policy scholar. I'm really interested in how folks make meaning and different sort of policy actors. And the idea of causal stories resonates in how I'm thinking about resilience here. The idea that Deborah Stone has sort of written about how, causal stories kind of blame one set of people for causing the suffering of others. They kind of apportion blame. They demonstrate how one set of people brings about harms to another set. And sometimes the move to resilience is comforting to folks because it's able to sort of locate and apportion blame. And I was just looking also at the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, Theresa Tam, who's been in the news a lot, wrote this huge report on the state of public health, and it was called From Risk to Resilience, an equity approach to COVID-19. And it mobilizes all the same kind of tropes about building individual and collective resilience. It does talk about some of the really, serious structural problems in the economy and in society, but it also talks about how we have to prepare for future crises and disruptions. The reference to resilience, there's about 70 references in the document to resilience, and the only examples of resilience that are really mobilized in that document refer to Indigenous people. And I think that's interesting in the context of colonialism, right? So, our government, Canadian government, has been really criticized heavily, and quite rightly, for kind of emphasizing reconciliation, which is seen as a more passive way of addressing serious, long-standing issues. So in the last few minutes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about feelings, not mine, but just feelings, I guess, in the sense that I'm trying to sort of work against the current in political science and other fields that says that feelings get in the way of sound decision-making, policy-making. Andrea was talking about decisions around vaccines, which are really emotive, right? I mean, I think people make decisions for all kinds of reasons. So my starting point is that our ability to reason and to think doesn't stand outside of our capacity to feel. And so I think that if we could move, focus our attention a little bit more on some of the emotions that are mobilized in policymaking in and around COVID, I think we would see that emotions move us, but they can also shift. I think the pandemic that has really disrupted a lot of our lives can transform our culture, our emotion culture. It can transform feelings about welfare and social assistance in ways that it can transform feelings about people with disabilities who are seen as vulnerable, who are seen as in some cases disposable. Like, is there an opportunity to sort of shift some of those meanings as well? But as the emotional landscape of COVID is really unfolding, but I think it's revealing of a range of feelings that matter as we grapple with this kind of fallout. And I just want to talk about a few, and then I'll say a closing note. Compassion and kindness is one. Thinking for me about compassion means appreciating that disabled, racialized, Black, or Indigenous people are right to be suspicious of all this compassion talk. If we want to combat injustice that existed long before COVID and a global health crisis such as COVID, kindness and compassion are one step. But compassion for vulnerable others, as philosopher Shelley Tremaine reminds us, should avoid naturalizing this term vulnerability. We talk about people as being inherently vulnerable instead of saying that institutions make people vulnerable. Institutions vulnerabilize people. They're not naturally vulnerable. Shame. Shame has been called our constant companion, and it's an interesting one to study as a critical scholar because it's slippery because it attaches itself to other emotions and then it transforms them. So, people who study this talk about affects as free radicals, and there is this sense in which how do we talk about shame in the context of a health emergency? I think the crisis has tested the patience of public health officials who are quite happy to sort of use shaming techniques. But draconian responses are problematic, especially when they're targeted at people who are already victims of state surveillance. Grief is the last one. And I think loss really kind of surrounds us, and processing grief is necessary, but also kind of thinking for me about the recognition that some of us have a greater capacity to grieve than others. Also the idea that some lives are more grievable than others. I think that's something that we've heard and seen really, really painfully. I think it's a painful reminder that grief comes in waves, but that those waters are really selective about who they wash over. So being attuned to feelings and emotions, I think, is as essential to our collective health and well-being as ventilators and PPE. I want to say that emotions matter, and I don't want to throw resilience completely, kick it to the curb. A colleague and friend who wrote to me recently after reading this piece said she would have described herself as a hardcore resilience hater pre-COVID. And now she says, oh, she's not so sure. She's seeing examples of mutual aid and community, and especially in disability communities. If you sort of look this up, there's really interesting examples of how folks with disabilities have really kind of led the way in that regard. So let's not toss resilience, but let's try to think about it critically. Let's try to, resist conventional definitions, because it means challenging policy that ascribes personal responsibility and blame under this kind of feel-good idea of social cohesion, community, solidarity, community action, building back better, and also thinking about how building back better also kind of imagines an enhanced subject, somebody who's not just coping or able to deal, but actually in better shape now, even stronger than they were pre-COVID times. So I think resisting resilience doesn't mean turning our backs on people who are managing, trying to cope with their lives in this pandemic. I think tending to what resilience does and developing those critical capacities is actually what we need to do. And that's it. I sound very directive there, but that's what I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orsini. That was such a sophisticated and nuanced critique of this really prevailing dialogue that we have in society that promotes resilience as the main goal, as our end goal during this pandemic. So there's so much to dive into there during the question period. And thank you also for your self-description. So although I'm familiar with image descriptions, that's the first time I've heard someone do that on a Zoom meeting. So something I'm going to be incorporating in the future. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and thank you so much to all of our presenters. That is the presentation section of our program tonight. So thank you so much for everybody. This was really, I think it was the better than average share of these kinds of things. You never know what you're going to get when you log on to an event like this, but all of you were incredibly fascinating and so timely. These are the issues that everybody is talking about all over the world right now, and to have framed them in such an interesting way. So kudos to all of you. Thank you for being here.
So now we're going to be moving into our question period. I'll remind everyone that we have the Q&A panel where you can share your questions. And we will be able to read them out, or we can turn the microphone over to you and you can ask your question live if you would prefer to do it that way. We have just over 40 minutes, so it's time for a nice discussion. And I see that we have a question in the Q&A panel right now from Shannon Fraser. So I'm going to ask Shannon if you would like to read out your question on your microphone. And since you are the host, you have the power to turn the microphone on and off. Excellent.
This is only one problem. I can't see what my question is anymore. Okay, so my question was, I was wondering if all of them might be interested in talking about the phrase, we are all in this together, because this has been a phrase that you see in every window. It comes with a rainbow. Kids and lots of people are using it in a variety of ways. But one of the biggest things that that personally I see from it is that actually we're pretty much not all in this together. Or at least we're not all equally in this together. But I thought maybe each of you might comment on that with your particular focus, because I can see that it would have, that my issues with it might have resonance for all of you.
So for the sake of order, I'm going to suggest we go in reverse order of our presentation. So Michael, if you'd like to answer that first, so we're not all kind of dogpiling on that question there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't think we're all in this together. And I think that, again, though, that's a really kind of powerful way of connecting people who, in many ways are divided it could be along racial lines, it could be along, disabled, non-disabled, or able-bodied lines. But I think when you look at the examples in Canada, I think we have had some examples more inspiring or acts of kindness or what have you. But I think it's there is a sense in which that way of thinking is a sort of part of the mythology of how we kind of say we will get through crisis. And I don't want to say that people are not going to, people don't have the capacities to manage. I don't think it's happening in the kinds of ways that one can imagine are necessary. But I'm sure other folks have something more important to say on that.
Ashleigh, you can go next if you like, but also no pressure. If anyone doesn't have anything to add on this particular topic, that's okay. You can just
pass the mic to the next person.
Yeah, I mean, my brain thinks in ways a lot of the time, so I can't help it. But a lot of the, I think it's a around government. The question that always comes up for me when I think about this is, fitting for an authentic thing, is we're all not in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. It's a very Instagrammable meme that's floating around out there. But I like that because it for me, for a lot of people, I think it helps recenter that idea of, this isn't us against somebody in a smaller or bigger boat. This is about all of us trying to figure out how to navigate this storm together. And some of those boats are better equipped at being able to manage that. And that's through a variety of reasons. And for me, that it becomes a useful metaphor and thought exercise for figuring out, well, why would someone have a bigger boat, or why would something be better resourced and better able to manage it, and what leads to those conditions? And when I think about this in rural urban kind of terms, is that we know that there's a beautiful quote, I'm just the author is escaping me, he's British sort of geographer, who says, geography is destiny, right? So, and one of the reasons that all geographers slowly become Marxist is because when you think about geography as destiny, and you think about it being about in Marxism, is because you start to learn that people on different ends of that river experience different outcomes. And why is that? And so we're all in this together really does kind of negate that from a geospatial and a sociospatial piece, that we're actually seeing that play out now in the second wave, and how dangerous that can become. I mean, Nunavut managed to have no cases for the first sort of 8 to 9 months, and now are having a rapid expansion of cases. And we're seeing the consequences now of a massive explosion in case numbers in a community that's several hours away from the only hospital in that territory. What do we do in that situation? They're not in the same boat as even downtown Toronto, which is experiencing some of the highest infection rates in the country, but also has access to the largest number of critical care beds and specialists in the country. Those will be vastly different outcomes. So even when we talk about, on a community scale, moving beyond that sort of individual notion of being it all in together and thinking about different areas of the country, we're seeing that play out with real-term consequences. And I think we're hearing there's been a lack of engagement from that by our leaders. So we have this interesting dynamic in a federation where certainly the devolution of the response to this to the provinces, because healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, and then the devolution from that down to municipal bodies, and jurisdictional issue actually then creates some of these layers in this mess that makes it difficult for all of us to kind of help get through that storm together. So similarly dislike it, and on another level, I think it's even more than just individual, but it becomes, spatial, structural, community to community, neighborhood to neighborhood, in terms of why that's happening.
Thanks so much. Andrea, did you want to add anything?
I'm really glad actually Ashleigh went right before me, because she gave a great counter proverb that works much better. And that's always the wonderful thing about Proverbs, aren't they? Like there are always two of them. They always go in pairs. And there's always the, absence makes the heart grow fonder, out of sight, out of mind. And they're a very convenient tool. We love to use them. Politicians love to use them as this, these trite little lines that are supposed to have meaning, and they frequently don't. The idea of the boat, I think, is a much better metaphor for a lot of us. And as someone someone living in the United States right now, my boat has a giant hole in it, and I would like some help, please. So I think we really do have to kind of move away from a lot of those, but we use them all the time. We use Proverbs, we use all these different phrases because they kind of tap into a feeling that we already experience, right? And it's the shorthand way of saying a whole bunch of stuff. And it is so problematic when people use them because they don't tend to use them either correctly or thinking about people other than outside of their own privilege. So that was a great two-set comparison to have those two right next to each other. Thanks.
Sophie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just briefly. I think it's a great question. I think all in this together is a statement of the privileged. It's one of those things you say, oh, we're all in this together. In the UK context, we obviously had the rainbows, the clapping for carers, and that rapidly, I think, has given way to an emotion of anger when there is a realization that people aren't in this all together, and that there are real struggles and inequalities that are coming to the fore, particularly over the summer. And I think even, when Bill Gates is saying we're not all in this together, and even Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, saying we're definitely not all in this together, they're pointing it out. And these are like, the captains of capitalism are saying that's not the case. There's inequalities here that have been exposed. And I think this is a wider question. I think a lot of people said, are we going to now be valuing carers, cleaners, public health workers, public sector workers? And no, we'll value them for a bit, but it was never as if society valued bankers over nurses, and that's why they get paid more. That's not how it works. So I would love that to change, but you can also see now in the UK, we're not building back better. We're not bouncing back in an enhanced way, as Ali Howe would say. We are aware of what's going to come next. And that is very much, we're not all in this together when we're going to be rebuilding the country in that way. And just quickly, I want to say that one thing about the all in this together, it does come back to this idea of global health security and collective security. Global health security originally was rooted in these ideas of human rights, the right to health and justice, but has now very much become about states protecting themselves from external threats. So even that's kind of come apart.
Okay, thank you everyone for those really interesting responses, and thank you, Shannon, for the question. We have another question in our Q&A window, so Andrew will read that out.
Yes, this one comes from Corey Scott. What would it look like to take feelings and emotions seriously in transformative ways moving forward? For Andrea and Michael in particular is this question, and I guess, Andrea, we can start with you. Could you tell us a bit more about the role that feelings or emotions should play in making change with COVID?
Sure. So yeah, I think we do have to consider feelings and emotions, and we still have this terrible tendency to think of feeling and emotion as feminine qualities that are not supposed to be addressed, and we're not supposed to talk about it. We're supposed to, be tough and just deal with it. And that's obviously not going to work. That's not going to work in this situation because we have so many different types of feelings. Michael had mentioned things like grief and other things like that, but there's also, people who actually don't mind this pandemic as much. So I've talked to people with social anxiety who are actually feeling like, hey, all of those symptoms are alleviated. People with fear of missing out, those symptoms have been alleviated. So there's a lot of things happening right now, and I think we need to think about that and process that. And hopefully, I love to think that in more recent years, we've gotten a little bit better about talking about our mental health. Of course, we're not 100% there yet, but I'm hoping that this will be, I don't want to say a positive outcome because I don't want to think of COVID as having positive outcomes, but maybe this will be a ray of sunshine, we'll call it, later on, is that we will get better about talking about our feelings and emotions, and that we will actually recognize that maybe more than, like, maybe everyone needs to be in therapy, right? Not just a few of us, or not just, this will be something that maybe we actually will put more effort into. But I think it's really, there's also a lot of other emotions too that are happening where people are really reevaluating a lot of their relationships, their what they're doing with their life. There's all those kind of things. Like there's the obvious ones, and I know Michael probably just did not have enough time to get to all of these because this is so complicated. But there's the immediate obvious ones, but then there's all these other things that we're feeling, and it's it really affects how we believe about things. And I always like to talk about belief as a system, because all of these things have to work together, right? And then when one of your beliefs falls out, you have to, it's not just like losing one thing, it's losing an entire system that works and it's interconnected. So it's not easy transitioning your mindset. So that's something else we kind of have to think as well. And I'll stop. I'm not the expert on emotion. I'll let Michael talk about that for a while now.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. And I mean, I need to finish writing a book before I can probably properly answer the answer. But one quick thing about vaccines that is interesting around emotion is that I think one of the problems I have with how people talk about emotion is that they mobilize emotions to sort of suit their particular kind of frame, so that public health folks will use emotional language, but they always talk about being framed in the language of evidence and science, and I would push back at that, because I think it's also led to really infantilized views of people who are vaccine hesitant who are dismissed as anti-vaxxers. But that's for another time. As far I guess to what's transformative, I guess I would start with pushing back against the idea of good and bad feelings. I think that's been something that I've seen and have been trying really to think with, because there are legitimate reasons for people to be angry right now about all kinds of things, and COVID is one of them. So there are important reasons why Black rage is dismissed, and people are afraid of that kind of anger. But that's legitimate anger. The AIDS movement was born out of the anger of gay men who were dying in record numbers, right? So at the same time, as I was saying earlier, compassion as an emotion is something we want to sort of privilege. Think about kindness. I mean, New Zealand's Prime Minister talks a lot about kindness. I think one has to also push back against the idea that it's inherently good, right? So that's where I would start. And I guess the last thing I'd say, Corey, is this notion of feeling rules that comes out of the sociology of emotions literature has been helpful for me in sort of saying that there are rules and about when it's appropriate to feel, and not everybody has the capacity to feel or permission to feel. And that's part of the privileging, right, in our society, that some people get to express themselves, and they express themselves through their kind of political opposition to something, whatever. But there's a sort of a structuring and ordering of emotions. It's not just they're all out there in the ether somewhere. And so trying to think about that for me is another way of going back to thinking about how political power is rationed and apportioned. But that's just a quick response. Thanks for the question, Corey.
Thank you very much for those responses. And I'll remind everyone that you can continue to type your questions in the Q&A window throughout this discussion, and we can read them out, or you can indicate if you'd like us to turn off your mic so you can speak them. I have a question I'd like to ask, and this is particularly relevant to Sophie and Ashleigh's presentations. So Sophie, you mentioned this very interesting issue that the WHO's recommendation is not to shut down international borders during a pandemic because of issues like discrimination of various nationalities entering countries, issues like stocking difficulties if there are challenges moving between different jurisdictions. In a place like Canada, border closures, not only between Canada and other countries, but also between provinces, has been one of the main strategies for controlling the spread of COVID-19. And I'd really like to ask both of you what your analysis is of controlling population movement as a way to address a pandemic. Is it effective? And also, is it ethical? We did in Newfoundland and Labrador, as you may know, had a court challenge to the fact that we are controlling entry to other Canadians into our province in order to address spread of the virus. And the Supreme Court in our province found that it did not violate the constitutional rights of Canadians because of the notwithstanding clause, which essentially allows you to suspend certain rights in times of emergency like these. But I would love to hear your analyses from your two perspectives of what is ethical and what is effective about controlling population movements.
Sure. Thank you so much. Shall I go first? Okay, great. So the short answer is I don't know, because this is a kind of burgeoning debate, and I've been actually trying to get this information from people who are actually systematically reviewing how effective border closures are, because everyone points to New Zealand and says, look what happened there, as you quite rightly say, internally in Canada. So are they effective? There are lots of people who argue both sides of saying that that works. So, and then the problem is, when do you lift them? So when do you start to lift those control over movements as well? So I'm sorry, that's kind of unsatisfactory, but I think the ethical question is perhaps a bit more of an interesting one, because it's not just the right to movement, it's also about the right to control data about who moves and how they move and how that's enforced and how that comes up against citizens' rights, human rights as well. And also the question of how people live these days as well. So if, you know, it's the idea that families live in one space or they live in one geographical location, and that is not problematized in any kind of way. So we make certain assumptions when we implement these kind of strategies that really comes up not just against the ethics of our ability to move. And I think this also comes back to this wider question of who has the right to say that they can move, but also how we live and what people will tolerate with that as well. So the ethical, I think, is very knotty. And this is also quite an issue when you have these debates over those countries that were seen to have effective COVID responses, where they have much quicker, faster lockdowns, huge tracing systems that captured personal data and shut down borders. Now, in Europe, there's that debate that would never have worked. It's seen that, okay, would that have been tolerated by citizens? We don't know. I mean, that's just a kind of conjecture. So, yeah, waiting to see the actual results of the studies that are going on at the moment. There is a study that's funded at Simon Fraser University that's actually looking at that. So hopefully the results will come out soon about borders. And also just a quick note on affect. Emma Hutchinson's work from the University of Queensland is excellent on this as well, Corey, about it's not just this negative, what it takes away, but how it produces certain types of international relations that could be interesting as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie. And I will pass the question over to Ashleigh. Can you talk a bit about the ethics of controlling movement between jurisdictions?
Sure. So I'm going to preface this by saying not a public health expert, not an ethicist, and not a philosopher. Any of those things. I am a truly interdisciplinary scholar. I come from international development, then public administration, now rural studies. So my thinking comes from a lot of places and is maybe more pragmatically oriented in terms of how does this work in practice. So when I'm thinking about restricting travel, and it's funny because I have a piece that we're submitting just actually next week around the right to be rural in a pandemic and the different narratives in the United States and different parts of Canada, and the reaction to the Atlantic bubble, which is now kind of had been seen until as late as last week as this great case study, an example of sort of a midway solution, right? So you had kind of a regional approach to this, but it was open to people that was more localized, still free movement within that, but some protection on the other side. And maybe I'm more interested less in the sort of the hard international borders than I am in this interregional travel, because when we think about communities, Sophie's point is well taken, the road goes both ways, right? It's not just that urban people want to come to rural areas for tourism or leisure or for any number of reasons. Rural people need to get to urban centers for a wide variety of reasons, whether that's medical care, family, also tourism, any kind of those interests and economic benefits go both ways. So it's not as if there's a gate at one end of the road that says all the benefits come from here and go to there. We also don't have necessarily the infrastructure in place that would have allowed that to work really effectively. When we talk even about enforcing the bylaws we had in place to shut down some of the activities associated with high risk, we struggled with that. So how were we going to manage every back road, every gravel road, every single track road, every highway around keeping people out of movement? So I think that in the North American context, that becomes a bit tricky in terms of just the sheer amount of covering. It's different than even New Zealand or different parts of the world when we think about just spatially, how would we do that in this country? I joke, a lot of people think that I spend time and work in Northern Ontario when really it's the Bruce Peninsula and vast amounts of the country go much further than that. So in terms of managing that, it becomes tricky. The ethics question becomes really about, this is the trick that I've been wrestling with in my own brain around this, is how much of policy and governance is set to create regulations and rules or to send signals to people around what is and isn't good or okay or safe in this environment, and how much are we relying on sort of that individual morality argument for people's behavior. And this becomes complicated in a lot of jurisdictions where if you say that it's not actually illegal or not against the rules to go to a bar or your cottage or a restaurant or a party, the tacit implication there is that it's safe and okay, rather than just, we don't recommend it, but if there's no hard barrier in there, then it becomes an argument around how do we lay blame at the end of it on people's laps that they didn't do the right thing when the direction around what the right thing to do wasn't clear to begin with. And so that's why, like, Michael's points around the lessons we learned from harm reduction and how we clearly communicate these things. And I think when it comes to that interregional travel, the most successful cases actually really did focus on that harm reduction piece, right? Not that you're a bad person if you do that, or here's all the consequences, but really what we tried to do, and a lot of messaging that I was doing with rural leaders, was we want you to come here. We know we benefit from your presence, but now is just not the time. Please, if you love us the way that we really want to welcome you, here's how we do that. And so having that more human conversation becomes maybe less high-minded about the ethics of it, members of the same community. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this in the context of the One Spoon Covenant and, our responsibility not only to the land, but to each other. So when we enact it, the ethics become a lot clearer, right? Like, what is the right thing to do, not only for myself, but for each other? And how do I communicate that clearly? And where we fell off was when, well, if it's allowed, if these places can be open, if I can go there, if there's no real clear direction, we lost that. And that's sort of the nature, I think, maybe of the ethics of the individualist culture versus the collectivist culture and how we navigate that arrangement. In rural communities, it tends to be a little bit more collectivist because you kind of have to be, right? Like your local counselor is also the librarian, is also maybe a business owner or owns a shop or all those kinds of things. And the survival of a lot of really small rural and remote places hinges on people not actively being jerks to each other. Like, you just can't do that. And so I think appealing to some of that was helpful, but I don't know how much responsibility does that leave at people's feet. So big question mark, as Sophie said, because we don't know. We just don't know. I hope to have some exploratory stuff out soon around some of those questions based in the right to the city and the right to be rural and what does that mean. But for right now, I think, everything we thought was working in terms of those restrictions, even if they were things that we raised eyebrows about, seem to not be working now in this second wave or have collapsed in some sort of way. And so things we thought were right and ethical and the true way to go about it are coming back to get us. So I think we'll be a long time teasing that one out.
Thank you both so much for your very interesting responses to that question. And Ashleigh, I appreciated that you raised the distinction too between what is legal and what is moral, and the question of sort of social responsibility and how do we determine what our social responsibility is? Is it by looking to guidelines and regulations that are being provided to us, or is it by looking at community needs around us? Now, we do have another question that's come up in the chat.
Yeah, so this one is from Francesca Scala, and this is for everybody. So we can just start with you, Ashleigh, since you're here. Is the mistrust or trust of science experts, the WHO, et cetera, unique re COVID, or is it part of a broader long-term trend that predates the so-called post-truth and pandemic eras both? Anybody can weigh in on this, of course. Ashleigh?
Yeah, so there was a great piece of scholarship out of Europe, and Andreas Rodriguez-Posay wrote about the revenge of places that don't matter, and about how the way, as I said before, geography is destiny, how that is playing out in terms of the association of socioeconomic geography is leading to greater and greater political divides. And that has a lot to do with the areas that we often see associated with different kinds of economic activity, experiencing a decline in those and no replacement. But then also this thing around not feeling represented or not feeling heard for a large variety of reasons in these larger institutions. And I mean, from a more social science perspective, a less economics-based one, we look at these kinds of questions, or at least I've been curious about them, in terms of how does that become the dominant narrative in a rural area, right? That no one's listening to us, no one hears us, the people in power don't represent us. When in a lot of cases we've seen, different areas have an outsized influence almost in electoral outcomes. So, the actual reality of something versus our imagination of what's happening sometimes work. And that distrust in government gets fed, right? It gets fed by narratives that benefit from that kind of discord. And I think it predates the pandemic, but we've seen an escalation of it. And in the same breath, though, we have a real danger on behalf of some of these institutions and people, even people who might be in this room, that would say, I'm thinking of being in the southern US and stuff, and there was some great stuff going around right now that says, you're not better than the South. There are lots of progressive leaders and movements coming out of the southern US. Actually, the whole civil rights movement, a whole bunch of wonderful, powerful movements originate there, but we talk as if they're just a bunch of backwards hillbillies. We do that in Canada as well, around rednecks and people that have to be, they're too busy mining or working in oil and gas or working in forestry, so they can't possibly be intelligent. And then that sort of stokes all of these things, right? If someone is approaching you from that perspective, why should I buy into anything that you're telling me? You don't understand my experience. You don't seem to care about my experience. All you're telling me is my way of earning a living is wrong. The people that I associate with are wrong. And so that's, Michael's conversation around how do we approach these conversations matter. So this mistrust of science, I do a lot of work on evidence-based policy as well, stems around what do we consider evidence? Whose stories are we listening to? Where are we getting that data? And then how is it getting used? I don't care what anybody tells you, they're not doing evidence-based policy, because more often than not, a conversation for 25 seconds with a deputy minister in an elevator has more impact than almost any article or book or anything that you could write. So it's about access to those networks, and do they believe you and have trust in what you tell them? And how do you get access to those networks? Who has access to those rooms? What kind of evidence are they bringing forward? People pick up on that, right? This is not hidden. This is not sort of hidden chess. People, I think, are implicitly understanding that that's happening. And so if I can't see it, I don't understand what's going on, I don't trust it. And here in Ontario, we have a really big problem right now. I think if folks have heard around the report from the Auditor General that just landed today, concerns about the chain of advice going through our public health officers versus what's being implemented politically. All of that breeds distrust. And I don't understand it, and I don't have to care about it. I'm too busy doing other things around ensuring my survival. So as long as that becomes the churn, as long as we're constantly in a place where we don't have the time, space, resources, or capacity to pay attention to the systems, and the information is not being fed back to us in a way that we can understand, then that trust issue becomes something that's going to continue. And when you have two kind of seeming authority figures talking at the same thing, but saying vastly different things about it, how can I read one thing and come to a totally different conclusion than someone else? And we're reporting that as if both are equally valid. We're going to get ourselves in trouble. We have to stop acting as if all opinions deserve equal airtime as part of this as well. So That's my soapbox. I'll get off of it now.
Thanks very much, Ashleigh. And one thing that I picked up on that you said that I thought was really insightful is how we dismiss people from rural areas or areas like the American South that are perceived as backwards or not progressive or what have you. And you use the word redneck, which, if I recall correctly, was originally a term that was used to denigrate rural activists, people who were, demanding their rights. And they turned it into a term to insult rural individuals as though they're less intelligent than urban individuals. That was a really interesting point there. So I'd like to now pass the question over to Andrea. And again, the question is whether the mistrust of science and expertise is new with COVID or if it's part of a broader long-term trend that predates the post-truth era.
Yeah, this is nothing new. So, and I think Ashleigh did a great job of kind of describing why we do really have to think about why people do feel marginalized, especially people who aren't actually marginalized. And that's a really big conversation to have. And I love how you bring up too with the American South and how it's really perceived as being this redneck hick, to use the Newfoundland term, skeet place that. And it's really not. And I live in a large blue dot because it's in part because it's a college town. But then you have, of course, the Electoral College showing us exactly how much a state like North Carolina, where I live, which should be blue, but because the Electoral College is red. So that's like a really great a good way of kind of thinking through that. So it also shows you right there that the people who perceive themselves as being not heard and not understood are actually overly heard and understood. Perception they're not being heard and understood too. But that doesn't mean that people aren't hearing those things. And we have to start with what their beliefs are about themselves. We can't start from this place of, oh, by the way, you have tons of privilege. That's not a useful place to start, because then we're just going to have an argument about whether or not they have privilege. But then the other side of that, of course, is that people who are Indigenous or Black have all the reason in the world to have mistrust because they've been actively worked against, especially when we talk about it in medical terms. And I very briefly mentioned medical racism, which is a massive problem in the US. Our birth rate, our maternal care after birth is horrendous. Generally speaking, especially for a country of our size and supposed means. But if you look at it for Black women, it's a million times worse. So these are not things in the past. These are things that are currently happening. We've recently learned that women at the border were being, forcibly having hysterectomies. Like that's something that should have never happened in the first place, but we knew happened in the past. But then we found out, oh my gosh, that's happening again. So in those cases, it's like, no, okay, I understand why they don't have a strong trust, especially in the medical establishment. The medical establishment has not proved itself, and that's also on an individual level with medical racism. There are still people, there was actually a study that came out fairly recently that showed that a lot of interns, people who are training to be doctors, still believe that African Americans do not experience pain in the same way that white Americans do. And that was just shocking to hear that, in 2019, that there are people who still believe a lot of these urban legends. So that's, it's so shocking to hear. So it's interesting to think about it in those two terms of the people who, deserve and rightly so don't trust these large institutions, but also the people who perceive people as being against them. Because again, if we're going to have a conversation with those people and we're going to try to understand their perspective and hopefully bring them around to, I don't want to say bring them around to our perspective, because that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to find a middle ground. We still have to understand why they feel that way, and understand that people are sometimes against them. Like that's not always entirely made up. Especially when we're talking about rural areas, there's definitely tension in a lot of those places, and that's definitely shown true again in the American election recently.
Michael, would you like to weigh in here?
If I have if you have time, I'll just quickly just to kind of reiterate this idea. I mean, it's an indictment of public health in many ways, but this sort of information deficit model that folks just need more information and they'll make a sound decision has been shown to be colossally, I think, wrong, especially since the people who make decisions that public health folks don't like are normally quite highly educated, informed. So it's this idea that we're like passive receptacles. Just give me the knowledge, give me all this evidence, and we'll make the right decision. It's been shown to be wrong time and time again. The other thing I'd say, having studied autism and been kind of looking at a lot of the stuff around the MMR vaccine, Jenny McCarthy in the US at one point said, Evan is my science, to talk about her son. This is kind of in some way a positive development around challenging expertise, challenging medicine, having this kind of dark side, which is, the cigarette industry saying that the evidence about the link between lung cancer and smoking is, we're not sure about after 50 years of research. It's kind of a way of twisting what was essentially, I think, a pretty positive development, which was that citizens can challenge expertise and science, and now it really has had this kind of dark effect, and we're sort of still living it. The residue of that, Brazil. Think of all the places, but yeah, it's a big one.
Okay, I think, Sophie, you're the only one that hasn't weighed in. Would you like to add anything just to close us off here?
I would just concur with my fellow panelists, actually. I think it's a real issue around the scientists and the experts themselves. I think we always think about post-truth and trust of science and expertise as being so populist leaders are to blame for stoking these tensions. And I think that is quite right. But as Andrea was quite rightly saying, look at the history and contemporary medical racism that happens. It's not surprising that you may question some of these scientists and experts. So I think it's about how scientists and experts present the information, how they engage with people, how they relate to the communities in which they live. And as Michael's saying, not just seeing that people are like vessels that we just say, this is what you do, and people just absorb it and say, oh yeah, that's fine, thanks so much. I don't even know what an epidemiologist is, but okay. And I also think, just to finish, there is a responsibility around academic freedom and what you comment on or what you don't comment on. And it's been very interesting with COVID-19, as someone who's worked in this space for a long time, who becomes the expert. So I don't say anything about epidemiology. I've got my opinions, but I am not an epidemiologist. And I know it's trendy to say, slay in your lane, don't stay in your lane. But in this, it is hugely important that experts stick to their area of expertise.
Thanks, Sophie. That was wonderful. And thank you to everybody. So I'm going to just close off now. It's almost, we're getting on to 9 o'clock Newfoundland and Labrador time, or Newfoundland time, I should say. So thank you so much for all the questions. That was wonderful. And thank you to all of our panelists for being so generous with your time and also with your knowledge as well. And I'd also like to take this time to also thank Dr. Isabelle Cote, who's responsible for bringing us all together tonight. So thank you very much as well, Isabelle.
We have a few additional people we would like to thank for the work that they did on this event. Shannon Thompson and Shannon Fraser and Sheridan Thompson for their help organizing and doing the technical background on this roundtable. They're both PhD students in interdisciplinary studies at Memorial University and research assistants with the Nexus Centre.
I'd also like to thank the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. Their financial support made tonight possible.
And finally, Dana Rideout and Danica Pike, thank you for your work interpreting this event. We really appreciate it. Both of them are with the NL Association of the Deaf, and you can contact NLAD if you're in Newfoundland and Labrador to secure interpreting services. So this event will be posted online, hopefully in the days to come, if you would like to have a look and review anything that was discussed here.
Or share it with some of your friends who couldn't make it tonight.
Absolutely. The beauty of doing online events is that they can live on and we can share them with people who couldn't attend them live.
And the curse is that it stays in our memory forever. So if we messed up, everybody is going to know about it. The
blessing and the curse is it lives on. So thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. And if you'd like to learn more about the Nexus Centre and the interdisciplinary work that they do, they continue to host events like this throughout the year. So you can Google them. That's the Nexus Centre at Memorial University. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, you can stop the video now.
I know.
You're still recording. You're still recording, Shannon.
I stopped.
You did?
Yeah, I stopped it. Did you stop? Oh, I stopped it. Oh, I stopped.